What if everything you learned about the Sioux was only the last chapter of a story that stretches back further than anyone imagined? And what if the proof was locked inside a single strand of hair, waiting for science to finally catch up with what one family had known all along? If you love history that punches you in the gut with the truth, you are in the right place. Hit was only the last chapter of a story that stretches back further than anyone imagined? And what if the proof was locked inside a single strand of hair, waiting for science to finally catch up with what one family had known all along? If you love history that punches you in the gut with the truth, you are in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who thinks they already know this story. Trust me, they do not. Most people picture the Sioux the same way. Feathered headdresses, painted horses, warriors charging across an open, windswept prairie. It is a powerful image. It is even a real one, but it is also one of the most incomplete pictures in all of American real one. But it is also one of the most incomplete pictures in all of American history, because behind that image is a journey so long, so complicated, and so deeply human that it makes the Plains warrior story look like a footnote. We are going to follow that journey today. We are going to start with a lock of hair that sat in a private collection for over a century. We are going to move through genetics, through migration, through displacement, and through a mystery that scientists still have not fully solved. And by the time we are done, you are not going to see the Sioux the same way again. Let us start with the hair. Sitting Bull is one of the most recognized names in Native American history. He was not just a warrior, he was a spiritual leader, a visionary, a man who held together multiple bands of Lakota and Cheyenne fighters at a time when the United States government was tearing apart every treaty it had ever made. The motivation behind those broken treaties was simple and ruthless. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, land that had been legally promised to the Lakota. The government wanted it back. Sitting Bull stood in the way. In 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he helped orchestrate one of the most stunning and ruthless. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, land that had been legally promised to the Lakota. The government wanted it back. Sitting Bull stood in the way. In 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he helped orchestrate one of the most stunning military defeats ever suffered by the United States Army on its own soil. General George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry rode into a battle they did not understand, against warriors they had underestimated, and they did not ride out again. It was a moment that shocked the nation. It also sealed Sitting Bull's fate. He was killed in 1890 by Indian Agency police during an attempt to arrest him. In the chaos that followed, a military surgeon took a lock of his hair as a trophy. That act, grotesque as it sounds by modern standards, was common in that era. Soldiers collected pieces of their enemies the way others collected souvenirs. The hair passed through private hands for over 100 years, traded, stored, and largely forgotten by the wider world. But in 2021, a genetics team at the University of Cambridge, led by Danish researcher S.K. Willerslev, got their hands on it. They extracted DNA from that hair and ran it against the genome of a living man named Ernie Lapointe, who had always claimed to be Sitting Bull's great-grandson. His family had kept that story alive through oral tradition for generations. Names, relationships, events, all carefully preserved and passed down. The science confirmed it. Lapointe carried measurable, verifiable genetic continuity with Sitting Bull. The bloodline was real, unbroken. A man standing in a laboratory in 2021 was looking at proof of something his family had always known, but the wider world had never accepted. That moment was not just about one man or one family. The world had never accepted. That moment was not just about one man or one family. It was a doorway. Because when the scientists dug deeper into that same DNA and into dozens of other genomic studies conducted over the previous 15 years, they found something that had nothing to do with Sitting Bull's immediate family tree. They found something that nobody expected, something that fundamentally challenges how we think the Americas were populated in the first place. To understand what they found, you need to know a little about how geneticists trace deep ancestry. Inside every human cell, there's a structure called the mitochondria. It is the cell's energy source, but it also holds its own separate loop of DNA. And unlike the rest of your genome, this mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child, every generation unchanged. Your father's mitochondrial DNA does not pass to you, only your mother's does. This makes mitochondrial DNA one of the most useful tools in human population genetics. It is a clean, unbroken record of your maternal ancestry, going back thousands of years. Scientists use it to assign every human being to what they call a haplogroup. Think of a haplogroup as an ancient ancestral category, a label that tells you which deep population your maternal line came from, where they lived, and how they moved across the planet. Native Americans carry 5 primary mitochondrial haplogroups. They are labeled A, B, C, D, and X. The first 4, A through D, tell a story that is remarkably consistent and well supported. Their ancestral forms are found in Siberia, close to a region called Beringia. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped hundreds of feet because so much water was locked up in massive glaciers. The shallow seafloor between what is now Siberia and Alaska was exposed. What emerged was not a narrow land bridge, but an enormous stretch of habitable land, over 1,000 miles wide in places, connecting 2 continents that today are separated by ocean. The ancestors of Native Americans crossed that corridor. Haplogroups A through D trace cleanly from Siberian source populations, across Beringia and into the Americas. The timeline works, the geography works, study after study has confirmed it. The science is solid, and then there is haplogroup X, specifically the variant called X2A. It shows up in roughly 15% of the Sioux population. That is not a trace amount. That is not a statistical glitch or contamination error. 1 in every 7 Sioux individuals carries this genetic marker. It is a substantial, consistent, meaningful presence in the population. But here is the problem. Haplogroup X is not found in Siberia. It is not in the populations closest to the Bering Land Bridge. It is not in any of the ancient Asian groups that genetic models identify as the founding ancestors of Native Americans. Every other haplogroup leaves a clear trail from Asia into the Americas, like footprints you can follow across a map. Haplogroup X, Bering Land Bridge. It is not in any of the ancient Asian groups that genetic models identify as the founding ancestors of Native Americans. Every other haplogroup leaves a clear trail from Asia into the Americas, like footprints you can follow across a map. Haplogroup X leaves no such trail on the Asian side at all. Where does it appear? In the Middle East, in the Caucasus Mountains, the mountainous region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and parts of southern Europe. The closest relatives to the Sioux version of this marker connect to populations on the opposite end of the Eurasian continent from where the Bering Land Bridge would have been. Populations thousands of miles away from anything that could explain a straightforward Asian migration. Scientists have a name for this puzzle. They call it the X problem. And it has never been definitively solved. 3 major theories have been proposed over the years, and each one is worth understanding because together they reveal just how little we actually know about who got to the Americas, when, and how. The first theory is the most dramatic. It suggests that some ancient population crossed the Atlantic, not in a modern ship, not on a raft, but by moving along the edges of the massive ice sheets that covered the North Atlantic during the last ice age. Arctic peoples have always navigated these kinds of environments by small boat, moving carefully from one ice edge to the next, living off marine resources along the way. The idea is that some group from Ice Age Europe or the Near East made that same kind of journey westward, eventually reaching North America. This theory gained serious academic attention in the 1990s and early 2000s because of a genuinely strange archaeological observation. Stone tools from the Solutrean culture of Ice Age Spain and France bear a striking resemblance to early Clovis projectile points found in North America. The shaping techniques, the way the flint was worked, the distinctive leaf-shaped design of the finished points, these parallels were close enough that credible researchers argued they could not be a coincidence. If tools from 2 continents looked that similar, maybe the people who made them had some kind of connection. And then a skeleton found in Washington state seemed to complicate things further. In 1996, remains were discovered along the banks of the Columbia River. The individual became known as Kennewick Man. He was over 8,000 years old. When researchers examined the physical structure of his bones and skull, some of them suggested he did not look typically Native American. His morphology pointed, some argued, toward European or even Polynesian ancestry. For a while, this seemed to lend weight to the idea that non-Asian populations had reached the Americas early on. The debate became one of the most contentious in American archaeology. Native American tribes, particularly the Colville and neighboring peoples of the Columbia Plateau, argued that the remains belonged to their ancestor and demanded reburial. Scientists fought to keep studying them. The legal battle lasted nearly 20 years. In 2015, Kennewick Man's full genome was finally sequenced. His DNA said something completely different from what his skull shape had suggested. He was unambiguously Native American. His closest genetic relatives were the very people who had been fighting for his return, the tribes of the Columbia Plateau. His bones had been misread. His genes could not be. The Solutrean hypothesis did not survive that test. Physical morphology, it turned out, was a poor guide to deep ancestry. DNA was definitive. But the X problem did not disappear with the Solutrean hypothesis. It just needed a different explanation. The second theory stays entirely within the framework of the Beringian migration, but adds an important detail. It suggests that the founding population that crossed from Asia into the Americas was never homogeneous. It was already diverse. It carried multiple genetic lineages, multiple ancestral threads, including an ancestral form of haplogroup X. The key to this theory is a concept called the Beringian standstill. Beringia was not just a crossing point. For thousands of years, it was a homeland. Massive ice sheets on both sides blocked passage east into North America and west back into Asia. The people living there were geographically isolated, cut off from both continents for an extended period, possibly several thousand years. During that isolation, the population was evolving on its own, developing genetic variations that existed nowhere else on Earth. The theory proposes that X2A evolved during or around this period, derived from an ancestral lineage that had existed somewhere in the broader Siberian world. When those people finally moved into the Americas, they took X2A with them. Back in Asia, the populations that had carried the ancestral form simply died out over time. They were absorbed by larger groups, displaced by climate shifts, or simply unlucky in the brutal calculus of prehistoric survival. The lineage vanished from Asia, while it thrived in the Americas. This explanation is logically coherent. It fits what we know about genetic drift and how small isolated populations can develop unique signatures. The problem is that it is nearly impossible to prove. Beringia is underwater now, has been for thousands of years. The burial sites of any people who lived there are sitting beneath the Bering Sea. We cannot test the DNA of a drowned civilization. We are reasoning from absence, and absence is a weak foundation for certainty. If you are the kind of person who stays up thinking about questions like this, you are exactly who this channel is for. Do me a quick favor. Before you go any further, drop a comment telling me which theory you find most convincing so far. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good moment. What comes next is even more unexpected. The third theory challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about the peopling of the Americas. For decades, the standard model assumed the migration was one way. Humans crossed from Asia into the Americas, the land bridge eventually flooded, and that was that. The door closed. The populations were separated. New research says that picture is wrong. A study published in the journal Current Biology examined the DNA of 3 individuals who died on a riverbank in Kamchatka in far northeastern Siberia, roughly 500 years ago. Their genomes contained a clear, significant signal of North American ancestry. Not a faint trace, not noise. Real genetics. Evidence that a population of Native Americans had at some point crossed back from the Americas into Asia, mixed with local Siberian populations, and left a record that survived into the historical era. The crossing appears to have happened across multiple generations, not as a single event, which means the Bering Strait, even after the land bridge itself had flooded, remained a zone of ongoing movement. Small boats could cross it. People did cross it. Genetic exchange between the two continents continued for far longer than anyone had assumed. Haplogroup X could have moved in either direction during that long period of ongoing contact, carried by small groups making crossings that left no trace in the archaeological record. 3 theories, each one plausible. None fully proven. The X problem is still open. And that is important to acknowledge because in the rush to tell a clean story, it is easy to grab the most dramatic explanation and run with it. The truth here is more honest than that. We genuinely do not know which explanation is correct. What we do know is that the simplest version of the migration story cannot be the complete one. But here is where the research pivots in a direction that is even more significant than the mystery itself. Because when scientists stopped focusing only on haplogroup X and started examining the deeper population ancestry of Native Americans as a whole, they found something that reframed everything. In 2014, researchers sequenced the genome of a 24,000-year-old boy found at a site called Malta near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. He is known in scientific literature as MA1. His remains had been preserved in permafrost, frozen soil that kept his DNA intact across an almost incomprehensible span of time. What they found in his genome was not what anyone expected. Between 14 and 38% of this ancient boy's ancestry came from a lineage closely related to the populations of ancient West Eurasia, the peoples of Europe and the Near East. He was not purely East Asian. He was a mix, a blend of East Asian-related ancestry and ancient West Eurasian-related ancestry, living in Ice Age Siberia 24,000 years ago, long before agriculture, long before any civilization we have a name for, long before anyone crossed into the Americas. Here is the critical part. That same ancient signal, that same West Eurasian-like component, appears in the genomes of Native Americans across the entire Western Hemisphere. Not just in the Sioux, not just in one region, in virtually every indigenous American population that has been tested, from the Arctic to the tip of South America. This is not evidence of recent European contact. Columbus did not bring this. The conquistadors did not bring it. Post-contact mixing does not explain it because the signal is found in populations that had virtually no contact with Europeans, and because the genetic studies can distinguish between ancient ancestry and recent admixture. This component was already present in the founding population that crossed from Asia into the Americas, carried there 15 to 20,000 years ago by people who were themselves already mixed. The blending had happened in Ice Age Siberia, in a world that had no written language, no nations, no borders, no concept of race. It was just people mixing with other people the way people always have. So when someone today asks where the Sioux come from, the complete answer has to account for all of this. Their deepest ancestral roots connect to a population in Ice Age Siberia that was already blended, already carrying the genetic echoes of both East Asia and ancient West Eurasia. Those people crossed into the Americas as part of the founding migration. They spread across an entire continent over thousands of years. Their descendants developed into the hundreds of distinct cultures and nations that existed when Europeans arrived. And then, separate from all of that ancient deep history, there's the more recent story, the one that still surprises people when they first hear it. The Sioux were not originally from the Great Plains, not even close. Their own oral traditions say so. When European ethnographers in the 18th and 19th centuries actually sat down and listened to what Sioux elders told them, they heard a consistent and specific account. The ancestors of the Sioux came from the east, from a land of forests, of rivers, of earthen mounds built by earlier cultures. A dense, green wooded world, utterly unlike the open grasslands the Sioux would eventually become famous for inhabiting. This was not vague mythology. It was precise ancestral memory, and modern linguistics and archaeology confirm it with striking detail. The Proto-Siouan language, the common ancestor of Lakota, Dakota, and all related Siouan dialects, traces back linguistically to the Ohio River Valley and the upper Mississippi region. Linguistic analysis places this origin somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The language family was born in the woodland interior of eastern North America, not on the plains. Archaeological sites in Minnesota, including Granite Falls and Browns Valley, confirm the presence of Dakota ancestors in the Great Lakes region during the late woodland period, roughly 500 BC to 100 AD. These sites contain pottery, burial mounds, evidence of small-scale agriculture, and the kind of material culture produced by people who stayed in one place long enough to develop specialized tools and artistic traditions. These were not nomadic buffalo hunters. They were semi-settled woodland farmers. For the vast majority of their existence as a people, the ancestors of the Sioux lived in forests. They grew maize, beans, and squash in garden plots near rivers. They hunted deer and smaller woodland game. They gathered wild rice, berries, and roots. They built their identity around a world of trees and water, of lakes and rivers and shaded paths through dense canopy. They had names for forest things. Their spiritual world was built from forest imagery. None of it had anything to do with the open grasslands. So how did they get to the plains? The answer involves another people, a cascade of colonial violence, and a remarkable act of cultural adaptation that unfolded in less than a human lifetime. In the early 18th century, the Ojibwe people, who had gained access to European firearms through the fur trade with French and British settlers, began expanding westward. They were themselves being pushed by pressures from the east, by the expanding edge of European settlement, and the ripple effects of colonial disruption moving through indigenous networks across the continent. That pressure displaced them, and their displacement, in turn, displaced the Sioux. The Ojibwe, armed with muskets the Sioux did not yet possess, moved into the Minnesota and Wisconsin region and driven the Sioux westward. It was not a negotiated boundary shift. It was a forced expulsion from a homeland. The Sioux moved onto the Great Plains, a landscape that was completely foreign to their traditions, their tools, their agricultural practices, and their ancestral knowledge. There they encountered the horse. Spanish settlers had brought horses to North America in the 16th century, and over the following generations, those animals had spread northward through a combination of trade, escape, and outright theft from Spanish ranches in what is now the American Southwest and Mexico. By the time the Sioux arrived on the plains, horses were already moving through the region, passed from tribe to tribe in a wave of transformation that was sweeping across the grasslands. What happened next is one of the most remarkable cultural transformations in recorded history. The Sioux recognized immediately what the horse could do for hunting, for warfare, for movement across open terrain. They adapted with a speed that almost defies belief. Within a single generation, they went from woodland farmers who had never seen a horse to some of the most accomplished mounted warriors on the continent. They developed new military tactics, new social structures, new spiritual practices, new relationships with the land. They rebuilt themselves from the ground up around the horse and the buffalo. The the people who rode into the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 and handed the United States Army one of its most humiliating defeats in history, had only been a horse culture for approximately 100 years, 1 century, that is all. The entire image the world carries of the Sioux, the feathered horseback warriors of the open plains, rests on a cultural foundation that is only about 100 years deep. Think about that for a moment. Take the full sweep of Sioux history, thousands of years of woodland life along the lakes and rivers of the upper Midwest, millennia of forest farming and woodland hunting, and then a forced displacement, a new landscape, a new animal, and a complete cultural reinvention within a single human lifetime. And from that 1 century, the entire world formed its image of an entire people. Not wrong, but radically incomplete. Here is what strikes me as the most profound thing in all of this. Not the genetics, not the migration mystery, not even the remarkable military history. It is the continuity, the unbroken thread. Stand at the edge of the Black Hills of South Dakota, the place the Lakota call He Sapa. Watch the wind move through the grass. The sky is enormous out there. The horizon is so far away it almost feels fictional. And now hold in your mind, at the same time, everything that brought human beings to that exact spot. A boy frozen in the Siberian permafrost 24,000 years ago, carrying a genome that was already a mixture of 2 ancient worlds. His descendants, living through an ice age on a land bridge that no longer exists, slowly moving into an empty continent and filling it. Their descendants becoming forest people along the rivers and lakes of the upper Midwest, building communities, farming, developing languages and stories, and a way of understanding the world. Those people being pushed off their land by a colonial cascade that started across an ocean and rippled outward until it reached their forests, arriving on a landscape they had never known, finding an animal they had never seen, becoming something entirely new within a generation, riding into one of history's most famous battles, and then one of their leaders' descendants standing in a laboratory in Copenhagen, watching scientists confirm in molecular detail what his family had never stopped knowing. That is not just history. That is the human story compressed into one lineage. It is displacement and adaptation and survival and